a nose for the truth, an eye on the numbers, and a heart for El Paso. We'll speak with ElPasoMatters.org President, CEO, and founder Robert Moore about the novel coronavirus and its effects on the borderland. I'm Duke Keith, and this is El Paso Townsquare. Very, very pleased to be speaking with Bob Moore, the President and CEO of El Paso Matters. You can find them online at ElPasoMatters.org. And Bob, thanks so very much for being with us today.
Thanks for having me, and thanks so much for all that Townsquare is doing for our community.
Well, we certainly appreciate that, and just trying to steer the show a little bit more to COVID-19 and novel coronavirus issues as El Paso tries to pull itself out of this, and like all the communities around the country, if not the world. But to you specifically and to El Paso Matters, first, congratulations for being a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize for your work with the Washington Post uncovering August the 3rd. That is a tremendous honor. And I would imagine after leaving the El Paso Times that you probably didn't think you would be nearly as busy. And obviously, August 3rd has its own connotations and issues surrounding it. But what a tremendous honor to be a part of a staff and a paper that was recognized, rightfully so.
Well, thank you, and obviously, there's no celebrating an honor like this because it was, such a huge, horrible incident in our community that frankly has changed El Paso like nothing that I've seen. But it was a privilege to be able to be a part of this team to help tell a more complete story about what El Paso was going through. I really appreciate the Washington Post giving me that opportunity.
It has been wonderful to see your byline in all sorts of places all across the country, and definitely for that story and for your coverage of such an important and a watershed issue here in El Paso, as is COVID-19 for the entire globe. And to that end, congratulations again to El Paso Matters for receiving your Facebook grant. What was it, $100,000 specifically for coverage of novel coronavirus? Is that pretty much covering it?
That's right, and I am deeply appreciative to Facebook for this grant. They gave 144 news organizations in the country grants ranging from $25,000 to $100,000, and I think it's really telling that 3 of those news organizations that received grants were here in El Paso. So in addition to El Paso Matters, El Paso Inc., and the El Paso Herald Post also received donations. I think that's a recognition by Facebook of 2 things. One is sort of the perilous state of journalism in our community and the border more widely because of various financial pressures that are hitting the media. But secondly, I think it's a recognition of the important role that El Paso plays in this country and more broadly in the world. We're right at the focal point of a lot of major issues, particularly around immigration and around global trade. So I think it's a great recognition of the importance of El Paso.
Well, it's kind of in the title of your publication, El Paso Matters, and it is both, I guess, subject and verb, isn't it?
Yeah, and so that's the dual meaning is quite intended, and I wish I could say that I came up with that idea all by myself, but like most good ideas, it was stolen from somebody else. So there are other media organizations that have used that Matters double meaning in their name, but I do think it's appropriate for what we're trying to do here in El Paso.
Certainly appropriate for El Paso, and local journalism does matter. You talked briefly, you touched on your work in this community. You left the El Paso Times as editor. And if you don't mind my saying so, my understanding is that you left rather than make more newsroom cuts, and you talked about the challenges to local journalism. But I bet you never thought you'd be as busy as you've been over the last year or two, leaving the El Paso Times.
Yeah, that's certainly correct. When I left the Times in October of 2017, I honestly had no clear idea of what I was going to do. I was fortunate to get a severance package that allowed me some breathing room to sort of think through what I wanted to do, and then I sort of stumbled into the second career as a border journalist for national and international publications, and obviously that was due to the policies that President Trump began implementing on the border from the moment he took office, but really escalating in the spring of 2018, which is when I began working for publications like Texas Monthly, the Washington Post, the Guardian out of the UK. So the timing was just fortuitous, and there was just so much happening at the border. Beginning with family separation issues. It's hard to believe that was just 2 years ago because it seems like a lifetime ago in some ways.
Right.
But we went from that to beginning in October of 2018, this huge migrant surge that was really focused on El Paso and the way this community was sort of left to its own devices to respond to this massive humanitarian crisis, and the truly magnificent job our community did during that. And then, up through the shooting of August 3rd, which was certainly connected to those immigration issues, and now up through the COVID-19 pandemic, it's just been one thing after another for El Paso. And again, I feel very fortunate to have been given the opportunity to help tell the stories of the way our community has been impacted by this series of challenges.
Speaking with Bob Moore, President and CEO of El Paso Matters. You can find it again at elpasomatters.org online. And I would imagine that this is the time when all of these stories started happening and El Paso did matter in so many different ways. This is probably when you had the germination of an idea of starting something like El Paso Matters. Would I be correct in assuming that?
Yeah, and so, even right after I left the Times, I had a number of community leaders come to me with just kind of general conversations about the future of media and what we might be able to do to sort of better protect a media presence in El Paso. And I didn't have an immediate answer, but it was something that was certainly always in the back of my mind. And so by early last year, I had a conversation with Eric Pearson from the El Paso Community Foundation about this growing movement toward nonprofit journalism as a way of supplementing and in some cases replacing traditional for-profit journalism that had relied heavily on advertising. That business model, that advertising-centric business model, has been deteriorating for all media for a number of years, but particularly for newspapers, it's essentially evaporated. And so in order to be able to exercise the important First Amendment role of media in this country, we have to begin to look at other ways of funding journalism beyond advertising. And so the nonprofit model offered a path to that, where you would rely on charitable foundation support. Individual memberships are a really important part of that, so support from your own local community. So Eric and I had a conversation, and we both had been thinking about this for a while. And so he offered quite a bit of support from the Community Foundation in the beginning for me, particularly to help with some of the legal issues around incorporation and everything. And they've continued to be a tremendous supporter of El Paso Matters in the subsequent months. And so I spent a good part of last year around my whatever free time I had when I wasn't covering mass shootings and immigration crisis. I was out trying to do some fundraising for this new website I wanted to get going. And so I'd raised enough money by January of this year to basically say, okay, I'll just do this as a one-person operation to start with and see where we can go from there. And so we began publishing in February, and that date was important because I wanted to start publishing before early voting started for the primaries.
Yes.
And so that was my early focus. Did some election coverage. I did what I think is a really good investigative article about the way Danny Olivas, the really well-known astronaut from El Paso, was sort of pushed out at UTEP in his view. So doing some, the beginnings of some important in-depth investigative work, and then beginning of March, the world changes, and COVID-19 arrives in El Paso, and that caused me to make a number of changes. I had to, of course, turn my reporting focus there, but it also was very evident that fundraising would be a much bigger challenge than I initially had hoped, because obviously when people are losing their jobs, they can't make charitable contributions. Foundations were seeing their corpuses just hammered by the stock market collapse. So I had to kind of adjust what I was doing there a little bit and scale back the expansion plans I had. But fortunately, in the last couple of weeks, I've received some really strong support from Silicon Valley. The Facebook grant was really important. There's been another substantial grant that's come through that I can't talk about quite publicly yet, but it was from a Silicon Valley foundation. So that's helping us now to begin to expand, and I'm hoping in the next 3 or 4 weeks to hire 2 or 3 more people to help cover El Paso.
Well, again, it is kind of in the title of the publication. El Paso does matter in many ways, and it's wonderful that that's being recognized even outside of El Paso. And we're very pleased to have Bob Moore, President and CEO of El Paso Matters. Again, elpasomatters.org. And we've taken a look at why El Paso Matters exists, where it came from, and, of course, a look at Bob Moore's, I guess, your tumultuous last couple of years. And, of course, COVID-19 is not making anyone's lives better or easier, but certainly rich for the news. And one of the things I think that sets El Paso Matters apart is its examination of data. You guys have done an excellent job of that, and I know that there are plenty of human interest stories that you can find, and including one we're going to bring up specifically that was published just this last week. But El Paso Matters, the impact from examining the raw data has actually led to the city and county government, actually the county government, turning resources to the place where there was an emerging COVID-19 hotspot, and that's the community of Tornillo. I mean, talk about that. And this is, honestly, why El Paso matters here. Just your look at the data and what you were able to find from it.
Yeah, and so the people who know me know that the role data plays in the type of journalism that I try to do. And I think that sort of really rigorous approach to understanding complex challenges requires a good knowledge of data and data analysis. And certainly with COVID-19 as a major public health issue, data is an important matter. And so, the city from the very beginning has done a good job of putting out these daily reports that show where COVID-19 infections are happening. And it's, a zip code based map that they put out.
Right.
And that's helpful, but what that map didn't do was account for population differences in different zip codes. And so naturally, the largest concentration of infections were taking place in the 79936 and 79938 zip codes out on the east side. Why? Sure. Because those are the zip codes that had the most people. And so what got lost in all of that was what was happening in some smaller communities. And the first one that I was able to identify was Tornillo, which is a community of about 4,500 people down in the lower valley. Beautiful area. They've had their own series of challenges in the last couple of years. Having to host the large child detention camp, and some other things. But this, low income for the most part community that relies on agriculture, and just kind of doing its own thing out there. Have a really good school system, really active superintendents. There's a lot of good things going on out there. But when I started to look at the numbers, when you overlaid the number of infections with population, it really became evident that there was this huge explosion of COVID-19 cases going on in Tornillo. And so I was able to identify that with data, then take that data, begin to talk with people in the community about how it was infecting them, and tell this really important story of a community that was being ravaged by a disease, was totally frightened, and had felt totally abandoned because none of the government entities were paying attention to them. And so that reporting helped devote some resources, particularly some additional testing resources that were then made available down there. And that outbreak is still going on. They still face a lot of challenges, but I think at least they don't feel abandoned anymore. And that's the role that journalism can play in helping to not only identify challenges, but also to begin developing solutions for those challenges.
I would imagine that their lack of population maybe worked against them because obviously everybody's looking for resources in the middle of this pandemic.
Absolutely. And, to put it crassly, there's not a lot of votes to be had out there. And so it's that sort of underserved population that most needs quality journalism to protect them.
And they got it, and that is a real feather in El Paso Matters' cap, but more so helpful to the people in Tornillo, Texas. What is the assessment on El Paso's progress from our local government? As the state begins to open things back up, and obviously more testing is being done. But what do El Paso's leaders here in the city, as well as the county too, largely, what do they think of our progress in flattening the curve?
The biggest issue that El Paso has been facing and continues to face is that we still don't have a really strong grasp of how widespread this disease is in our community. And that's because of the really low testing rates the United States as a whole has a terrible testing problem, and El Paso was far behind the rest of the country. We've been flying blind in some ways. For the first few weeks, the health department was not tracking how many tests were being done by private labs. They still can't tell you, who has been tested and where, for example. So there's a lot of blindness in our response. And so we're trying to craft policies without a really good understanding of what the problem is. Now we're beginning in the past week to expand the testing. Governor Abbott has put some additional resources in El Paso to expand the testing. One impact of that is that we've seen the number of cases shoot way up. The number of new cases reported on Thursday was 151, which was almost twice as high as what we'd seen before. But that's not an indication that COVID-19 is more prevalent in our community than what we thought. It's just another indication of how poorly we were testing the population before now. So we still have a lot of work to do in getting more widespread testing out there, have a better understanding of how many cases we've had, where those cases are, how many of them have been asymptomatic, what cases have presented complications, what does our unique border population mean in terms of how we respond to this. So my biggest concern has been that all of our policy choices have been made with very little actual data available to help drive those choices.
Well, and in being next to the country of Mexico, which obviously has its own issues, and in terms of personal income for folks and just access to resources is even worse than El Paso County, simply because of where they are. And here you have Mayor Cavada testing positive for COVID-19 and being treated for that. Being next to that country, and having people cross the border. And, people talk about the border being shut, and I know that the lines, I drive that stretch on Loop 375 and see the empty bridges at night. But there are still people who cross every day, and I would imagine that, there's no way to shut down the intermingling of our two cities. That it's just not going to happen. We are sister cities for a reason, right next to each other geographically. But I would imagine this also contributes to the whole issue of the spread of novel coronavirus.
Yeah, and as bad as El Paso has been on testing, Juarez has been even worse. The most common way, or one of the most common ways to confirm somebody has COVID-19 in Juarez has been when they died. And that's why you see they report 500 total cases and 125 deaths. So clearly they're not fully reporting. The Mexican maquiladora industry is under tremendous pressure from the U.S. auto industry and from other sectors to begin reopening. We've published a couple of stories from our partners at a website in Juarez called La Verdad that has been covering some really horrific outbreaks in the maquilas. And so as those places go back to work, more people begin to go back into the workforce in Juarez. Some of those people are going to go back and forth. Of course, a lot of the executives at those maquilas live in El Paso. So all of these unique factors create additional risks for border communities that I don't think the state government has really accounted for in some of its plans on reopening the economy.
Speaking of local, county, and state governments, how have they responded to the crisis in congregate living facilities? If you take a look at the numbers for COVID-19 cases, it is just exponentially strafing, especially those kinds of facilities for elderly folks, nursing homes, because this is a disease that attacks those who cannot fight it off. For older Americans and older citizens across the world, Italy, with a huge number of folks over the age of 65, has been one of the worst hit countries in the entire world. What about state and local and county actions toward congregate living facilities has been going on? You were the one who uncovered the number of cases at I believe it was a psychiatric center, behavioral health center.
Yep. So the big thing to understand about how El Paso has responded to this issue is that the public health department has shown far less transparency around congregate living facilities than most other public health departments around the country. They refuse to identify where outbreaks are occurring by facility name, and so they'll use these euphemisms such as healthcare facility. And I was able to quickly develop some sources that let me know that was the El Paso Psychiatric Center. They then came out and said, we have 33 cases in a detention facility, and they wouldn't identify that. And so a little bit of reporting showed me that was the state jail out on Montana Avenue. With nursing homes, the health department refuses to identify what nursing homes in El Paso have had COVID-19 cases. And just by way of contrast, I'd like to point out to your audience that the state of New Mexico every day puts out a news release that summarizes what's happening in the state with COVID-19. Every day that news release contains a list of every nursing home facility in New Mexico that has had at least a single COVID-19 case. The state of New Mexico is doing a far better job of informing its people of what's happening with COVID-19 than the local government in El Paso. And I'm just flummoxed as to the reason behind that. I think the public health department has long had a concern about creating adverse publicity for local businesses that may have health problems. And I certainly understand wanting to be careful in how they frame that, but I think it's just unconscionable that they refuse to identify sources of major outbreaks of COVID-19 in El Paso.
Well, that is, what do you gain by that? It's only going to cost you in the end. that flummoxes me as well. And I know that Michelle Lujan Grisham, the governor of the state of New Mexico, also upset with an outbreak at a facility that services ICE and the Federal Marshals Program in Otero County, which is, it's all kind of all the borderland. I know El Paso, it says El Paso Matters in the title, but you do cover New Mexico as well. And we talk about, any place where people are being kept, whether that is, a nursing home where somebody willingly moves there, or a prison, frankly, or an ICE detention facility. This disease seems to go where people are crowded in together.
And these are very vulnerable people, and it's easy to dismiss some population as, they committed a crime, or they entered illegally, so that they don't somehow matter to anyone. But these are human beings, and when we as a society take the decision to incarcerate somebody or to detain them, we owe them the responsibility to make sure that they're housed in safe conditions. And I do appreciate Governor Lujan Grisham's response to this. I, along with a couple of others, brought some of these concerns to the state government about what was happening at Otero and raised some questions. And after we raised those questions, again, the state of New Mexico began every day separately listing the number of positive cases at these detention facilities. Again, very welcome transparency, and I wish our leadership in El Paso would copy that transparency.
Yeah, and I know that you guys have the story that ICE is being sued by 6 detainees, 6 female detainees, and from middle age to senior citizens. Is there any progress on that story? Anything further that you can tell us?
Well, those women were all released after the story came out, and after the judge in the case, Frank Montalvo, made a tour of the ICE facility. ICE very quickly, this is the facility here in El Paso, right. ICE very quickly settled that lawsuit and released those 6 women. I think at least one of them is still here in El Paso because she had tested positive and is recovering, but I believe that the other 5 women are now elsewhere in the country with their family members.
Another story you have is some of the local nurses protesting against their PPE and that availability of PPE, personal protective equipment, in local healthcare and hospitals. And I know that one of the issues seems to be that elective surgery has been allowed now, but the plan was to stop with a positive test. The nurses are saying that changed to allow doctors to approve or disapprove elective surgery despite a positive test. Can you tell us anything further on that story as I read it at elpasomatters.org?
Yeah, so that was the story by Renee Kleidzik, one of the reporters who's been working with us for the last couple of weeks, and she spent quite a bit of time talking with the nurses who are just, they're really concerned, as are healthcare professionals everywhere, about having access to adequate equipment to protect themselves. And their concern is that if we get sick, then there's nobody to care for these people. And unfortunately, we've seen that happen around the country. And so, these are nurses, but, they're also mothers and wives and sisters. And, so they take this home with them too, and they worry about exposing their families. And so the nurses union here has been pretty vocal about this. The hospitals dispute some of the criticism, but it did become clear that at least with this one case at Las Palmas, the staff had been told that, we won't do any of these elective surgeries without a completed negative test. And the one nurse objected when the doctor said, we're going to go ahead with the surgery, even though we don't have test results back yet. That led to her being suspended, I think probably for insubordination or something like that, and that in turn caused another protest from the nurses union. So these are people who are obviously on the front lines of fighting this illness. They're at tremendous risk, and we ought to celebrate the sacrifices they're making on our behalf, and certainly I think everybody, including the hospitals wants to make sure that they're given all of the tools they need to keep themselves safe and to help their patients heal.
Well, it's certainly tremendous to see some of the names of some of those ladies and gentlemen in local healthcare around El Paso in that story. And speaking of names behind the numbers, your feature yesterday on Eddie and Ana Gonzalez was heartbreaking feature on Eddie, who has passed away from COVID-19, and Ana, who's still dealing with it, and their children who are, I guess, asymptomatic but have the virus. And you want to talk about getting behind the numbers. This is one of the things that'll just hit you right in the gut at elpasomatters.org right now.
Yeah, so every one of those numbers is a real person, and that's, I think, something that the media, myself included, often lose sight of. But when Ana told me her story on Wednesday, it was just devastating, and I mean it was so difficult for me to process that I couldn't even begin to sit down to write her story until the next day because I had to absorb it. But this is a family that took every precaution that they were told to take. They were wearing masks out in public before there was an order to do it. Ana really went out of her way to make sure her kids were safe and her husband was safe. And he was at a construction site as a supervisor there, and he did everything he could to make sure his workers were safe. But Ana and Eddie both developed the virus. And, Eddie went to a hospital on a Sunday, and he was dead by the following Friday. And just the speed at which this virus destroys lives is just incredible. And it's hard not to hear her story and really begin to more completely understand what this virus is and what it does and why it's so important that we all take precautions to protect ourselves and to protect everyone around us. And I think Ana's message at the end of the story about wearing a mask is something that really resonates with a lot of people.
Yes, a tremendous last line. And again, this is a story by Bob Moore, the president and CEO of El Paso Matters, up at elpasomatters.org. Well, moving on to look at the future. And I think when you think about the future, we all talk about the businesses opening up around Texas right now. And again, that is, it is interesting to read a feature like about the Gonzalez family and then turn around and see restaurants and haircut parlors and salons opening back up again. But looking to the future, I think the main thing that might concern folks is school. What is school going to look like come this August, come this summer? School, college as well. Do you have any guidance or have you received any guidance or heard anything about what the school districts around town are going to do come this fall semester?
Yeah, I think that the answer is nobody knows, and that's a frustrating answer to hear. I think the school districts are obviously all trying to communicate as best they can. I think around the graduation issue, they probably created some false hopes in some cases, and so they've got to be really careful about how they communicate. But the truth is, they're really trying to look at schedules. They're trying to look at how they get fewer kids into a classroom without hiring more teachers because they're not going to have the tax money to do that. So these are all challenges that they're doing on the fly, while simultaneously also having to figure out how do we do distance learning. So they kind of threw this plan together in March because they had to, and I don't think anybody even pretends to believe that the education kids have gotten over the last 2 months approaches what they would have gotten in the classrooms. But they have to figure out how to make that work. And so there are all of these challenges coming together, and we're going to make plans, and kids probably will go back to class at some point if not, right around August or September, but maybe a little bit later. But here's the thing I always remind people. The virus gets a vote.
Yeah.
And so what happens with the virus and what happens with us as individual humans on the choices we make greatly impacts these plans. And so it's one thing to say we want to reopen the economy, and obviously we cannot sustain having everybody staying at home for months and months on end because it would alter our standard of living in a way that's unacceptable. So we have to figure out a way to reopen the economy. But the government doesn't have a switch to flip to say, okay, now everything's back up, because individual consumers are going to make that choice. And the truth is that many, if not most consumers are not going to go back into large public settings like theaters, sporting events, and shopping malls until they feel safe doing so.
Sure.
And so whether it's a shopping mall or a school, we're not going back anytime soon to the life we knew as recently as February. So schools will reopen, and then they're probably going to shut down again during virus flare-ups. And so these are all juggling acts that we have to make, and we have to have patience, and we have to have patience with the policymakers, because they're going to have to make some judgment calls without a full set of information. These are going to be very, very difficult choices, but we all have a role to play too in our own behavior and in making sure that we're keeping ourselves safe and that we're keeping people safe from us in case we may develop the virus.
It's amazing to think about, and we talk about going back to schools, many of which, especially in the Ysleta School District, have been redone recently. All of the bond money that has gone into renovation of some of the campuses, Eastwood, a whole new campus, Bel Air. I see some Irvin High School in El Paso, Burgess High School in El Paso, EPISD, all around the city, all of this money being invested in real estate. And I just read a story about New York City. All of this business real estate, who's coming back to an office building? When is that going to happen? That is an absolutely huge and critical issue as economies reopen.
We're going to face it here too, and all of these issues tie together. As long as the downtown office buildings are closed here, all of the restaurants that make their money off of people coming to lunch aren't going to be able to get back on their feet. This is a good reminder of how interconnected we all are to each other, and a disruption in one person's life will have this massive ripple effect. And so we're going to be dealing with these ripple effects for a long time, and the likely outcome is that the way we live is going to be fundamentally altered in some way. It's just probably the closest parallel I can think of is September 11th of 2001.
Yeah.
We've recovered from that. We've made changes to adapt, and our life today is nothing like it was on September 10th, 2001. And I think the virus is going to have that same effect. It's going to reshape how we live in ways that we don't fully understand right now.
Bob Moore, President and CEO of El Paso Matters. We could probably do 5 shows like this. I've loved speaking with you, Bob, and appreciate the perspective. And once again, elpasomatters.org. Some accolades, deservedly so. And it's just the first few months of life. And all the best in the future to you and to the publication. Local journalism matters more than ever, and it is certainly reflected in what you find at elpasomatters.org. Bob, thank you so much.
Thanks for having me, Duke. I appreciate it.
Absolutely. Looking forward to the next time. And until next time, I'm Duke Keith, and this is El Paso Townsquare. So long, everybody.